one of the things that we are doing as we are creating this school or developing this school and putting the right kind of people in it is that we have a very sharp eye on connecting the academic side of the school with what many would call the real world out there, where the actual practice of what we learn in the classrooms happens. And I hope that it hasn't gone unnoticed the kind of professors we are bringing to this school. We're starting with Steve Young, for example, who spent tons of time out there in the business world and in the practice of sustainable development and environmental work, and then he came to this school. We talked about Larry Swadek, same thing, a lot of time in the trenches, and then to this school. We have Olaf Weber, same thing, a lot of experience in the real world of banking and finance, and interspersed with experience in the universities and so on, and eventually ends up here as an EDC chair. The next person who's going to be chairing the next session is no exception. Blair Feltmate has come to us from Ontario Power Generation, where he was Director of Sustainable Development Practice. And Blair, but he has very strong academic credentials. He has a PhD in ecology from University of Toronto. Then on top of that, he has 2 master's degrees. One of them that I find particularly interesting is his master's degree from Laurier in sustainable development. So again, to make the point that this school is about connecting the academy with the real world out there, and through this axis of the academy and the real world, making a difference in the real world where it really counts. So it is my pleasure to welcome here Blair Feltmate to take over, and I will also use this opportunity to say bye to you from my end at this point. Thank you very much for coming. This has been just really wonderful day, and it wouldn't have been so without you being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deep, and I'm certainly pleased to be here this afternoon to introduce a longtime friend, someone I've known for probably 15 or 20 years now, Dr. Stuart Smith, who will be this afternoon's closing plenary speaker. Before turning to further introductions pertaining to Stuart, I should say we will be out of here by 2:15 today at the absolute latest, because there is a wedding coming in here. So unless you want to be part of the bunny hop at somebody's wedding, we will be out at 2:15. I can guarantee you that Stuart's very pleased to be here this afternoon because for a variety of reasons, one of which is that his daughter and her husband, they've sold their home and they've bought a new one, and in the meantime they've moved in with Stuart, and along with them they brought an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And I know Stuart's house, and it's a very calm, serene, quiet, cerebral place to live normally, and right now he's just happy to be anywhere other than in his own home. It also occurred to me, though, that given that in his house he's probably hit the upper asymptote of the amount of chaos you can have in a house, I thought, I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old that I could come over to Stuart's maybe Saturday morning, drop them off at Stuart's house, and given that he's at the maximum level of chaos in the house, there's no reason why both of us should have an unpleasant weekend. I'll take my guys over and you can take care of them all. Anyhow, more seriously, many of you probably already know well of Dr. Smith, and for the few of you who may not be so familiar, let me highlight a few of his many accomplishments. Dr. Smith is a director and/or chairman of several advanced technology businesses, including Ensign Technologies, a firm which converts biomass to chemicals and clean energy. He served as the chair of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy from 1995 to 2002. Many of you will know well of him in that capacity. He was in the media effectively constantly during that period of time. He served in the early 1990s. He was the sole commissioner of the Commission of Inquiry on Canadian University Education, which he led on behalf of the Association of Universities and Colleges of Canada. From 1982 to 1987, Dr. Smith was the chair of the Science Council of Canada, and in 1989, at the request of the federal government, he chaired both the international peer review and implementation for the first networks of Centres of Excellence competition. He was leader of the Ontario Liberal Party from 1976 to 1982, having previously spent 8 years as a professor of psychiatry at McMaster University Medical School. When we were thinking about the person we would have to deliver this afternoon's closing plenary, Stuart's name came to mind immediately as one who would do a terrific job. And effectively, we thought of him for 4 reasons to speak here this afternoon. There's probably a longer list, but 4 reasons that immediately came to mind were: A, he speaks well, which is important. 2, he looks at the world through an interdisciplinary or sustainable development lens, and my sense is our future leaders are going to be those that have interdisciplinary backgrounds and they think in interdisciplinary ways, hence the launch of SEED. He tells it like it is. He won't speak in palliative terms in reference to, for example, the daunting challenges associated with climate change. And Stuart has thought long and hard about what universities should be. Of course, such thoughts are particularly applicable then today with the launch of our School of Environment, Enterprise, and Development. Following Stuart's talk, he will address questions, but as I said, we will be out of here before 2:15, hence the bunny hop. And now I'll turn it over to Stuart, who will speak to us about environmental challenges, Canada's economy, and opportunities for SEED. Stuart?
Well, thank you very much, Blair. This business about the wedding party coming in here at 2:15 or 2:30, it takes me back to when I was in politics. This honestly happened. I was at a Rotary Club lunch somewhere in middle Ontario, and I said, how long should I speak? And they said, well, you're the leader of the opposition, Dr. Smith, that you may speak as long as you like. We all leave at 1 o'clock. So this is now the second time I've heard, roughly speaking, the same invitation to address people. Look, this is above all else a happy day. I mean, and a very important landmark is being created here. The school, which has this lovely acronym SEED, is an example to Canada and to the rest of the world as to how we can assist society using the academy to be of assistance in the development of laws, policies, treaties, business practices. These are all things that are going to be needed. We know that. No matter what happens in the future, all the interesting panelists we heard had, I thought, remarkably intriguing views of the future. But in all cases, it's laws, policies, treaties, and practices that are going to have to be changed. That's going to require trained people who can do these things, and the trained people are going to come from here. In addition to which, you're going to have faculty who can do research work both on their own, independently, curiosity-driven if you like, but also on contract to people who will need this kind of brain power and expertise to create the various bodies and the various processes that are required to deal with the problems you've heard about. So it's a happy day, and I'm delighted. Of course, I'm sorry your president's not here, because David Johnston is also a former chair of the National Round Table. In fact, he was the first. I was the third chair of the Round Table, and he and I go back quite a long way. So congratulations on opening the school. You're going to have 2 sets of problems. The first, of course, has to do with being an interdisciplinary institute. And the second has to do with dealing, as you're going to try to do, with the environment-economy interface. That's something I was dealing with for 7 years at the Round Table. So let's talk a little bit about academe, just briefly, about the problems you're going to have with regard to being an interdisciplinary institution. Generally, they don't work. And however, they do work if you throw a lot of money at them. So that's just, the dean should be aware that that's one of the secrets of success here. But the problem has to do with designing career development pathways for faculty. That's the problem. Because with the reductionist approach that we take at universities, people work within their disciplines, they achieve some reputation within their disciplines, usually by publication. The only way their name will be known outside their own center, usually, is by publication. And if they want a job somewhere else, or they feel it's an opportunity to move on, or for some reason a spouse is moving to some other place and they want a job elsewhere, it's only by going to the head of their department within their discipline that they can get the kind of references which might get them the job. And it's very, very scary to a lot of people who are academics primarily to join a faculty of this kind because they feel that their discipline will turn its back upon them. And this has been the problem with trying to do interdisciplinary things. Now, it's a special problem in the case of the social sciences, and you are going to be, whatever you think you're going to be, in my opinion, you're going to be a social science institute. Because when I was at the Science Council of Canada, I came to realize that what we called science policy had very little to do with science. It was public policy for which an understanding of science was essential to avoid serious error. And the same can be argued here, that this will be an institute of public policy in one way or another, or private sector policy as well, in one way or another, where a knowledge of the natural sciences, environmental science, medical science, would be very helpful to avoid serious error. So you will be drawing in people who are experts in the so-called hard sciences, but policy making itself really falls within the social sciences. And it's an interesting business, the social sciences, especially as they've developed, because the usual dichotomy between pure science and applied science doesn't apply very much within the social sciences. Methodology might be considered a pure science within the social sciences, development of innovative methodology. But generally speaking, almost all social science is applied to something. And it's a question of how and what how you're going to apply it and to what you're going to do. You're going to do that. So it's a bit tricky to recognize that distinction doesn't apply so much. We found at the Science Council, the best people we got out of universities to work for us were people from the boundary disciplines. That is to say, the boundary of natural science and social science. Geographers. They turned out to be very good policy people. The boundary between medical science and social science, or for that matter, medical science and natural sciences, psychologists turned out to be good people for policy purposes. People who are comfortable in more than one realm of discourse, in other words. Now, of course, you're starting this school quite cleverly because you're not bringing in a bunch of academics to start with. So at least the faculty members you're getting are not going to be worried about their future, because the future for your graduates, and I would say for most of your faculty people as well, once the time comes to move on, will be with government, with business, with the media, with international agencies, and that sort of thing. Some might go into the academic area as administrators, but generally speaking, you're going to be producing people whose jobs, ultimately, in my view, will not be in the academy, but will be in these other areas that I've mentioned, as I say, the media, international agencies, and government and business. So that's what I wanted to say about your situation within the academic world. Now the tough one, the economy and environment interface. I mean, we've heard a lot today about externalities and pricing mechanisms and markets and so on and so forth. But if we just come down to the simplest idea of the whole environmental dilemma is, of course, the tragedy of the commons. I mean, that's basically the model for everything we do in environmental policy. And what we've learned is that if you want to do behavior modification to limit the use of a commons, a common good, or an underpriced or free good, you have to have at least three conditions in place. The first is that the threat must be clear. including both the nature and the imminence of the limiting factor. Now here's where you'll have to forgive me. You're going to get something you don't agree with. Most of you won't like it, but it's something that I really have a hobby horse about. The term sustainable development, if it does not refer to a specific and measurable limiting factor, then the term sustainable doesn't mean anything. It's a perfectly good word in English and in several other languages. Sustainable makes sense as a word. But for me to say this is not sustainable, what is it that's going to snap? What is the limiting factor? What is going to give? What's going to collapse? What is it that makes it non-sustainable? Otherwise, it's not a good term. And I have other reasons I don't like the term. First of all, it was a political compromise, if you remember back at the time before Rio, I guess it was, and when the Prime Minister of Norway was putting together a group of wise people, and they couldn't agree at all on avoiding a clash at the forthcoming conference. The poor countries were going to walk out. And they were saying, we've got to develop, and that's all there is to it. So this anti-development stuff doesn't wash with us. They say, okay. We won't be anti-development, but we'll be for a special kind of development. Sustainable development. Well, what does that mean? Well, we have no idea. Excellent, we're for it. And I mean, travesty that I put it this way, because everybody will tell you, that they know what sustainable development is. They don't. And then, of course, what happened at the same time is Reagan came along, and then you had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of Eastern Europe and communism, and a lurching to the right. So all of us interested in social policy and the fate of the poor among us had nowhere to go. We were getting beaten up. And so a bunch of people thought it would be a great idea, we'll attach ourselves to the environment. It seems to be going somewhere. And we'll make sustainable development a three-legged stool. It will have society as well as the environment and the economy. Well, I mean, that's fine, it's a three-legged stool, but it can't hold anything. The problem is it sounds good, and it gives the social science people or the social activists some place to hang their hat, but it accomplishes nothing. And now this term has been around for some 20-something years. And in all that time, I guarantee you, if you walk down to the main street of town and ask the first 25 people what sustainable development means, they won't know what you're talking about. It has not caught on. And anyways, that's enough of my hobby horse on that. But I prefer talking about social needs, talking about environmental protection, and not making up terms like sustainable development. But I guess I'm losing this one. I'm probably already lost it. But I just thought you should know that I'm still fighting. Okay. So if you're dealing with the tragedy of the commons, the second thing, apart from a clear and imminent threat, with knowing the limiting factor, is you need ultimately to bring in a law or an effective price. We all know that, and it's easier said than done. And then to get public support for change, you have there has to be a clear understanding of how the person whose support you want will be directly impacted by what it is that you're supposed to be avoiding. Because in the vast majority of environmental threats, we have a tough task. The point of no return, or the threshold, is usually not known. When you say, well, we keep going through our wetlands like this, we're going to reach a point of no return. Well, yeah, probably, that's true, but when? And then we say, well, we don't know. So most of the time, we don't know what the threshold is, after which we are in deep trouble. So we say the planet, you can't take a risk with it, it's too dangerous, and everybody nods their head. But unless you can show them the disaster that awaits with some clear understanding of why it awaits next Tuesday, then there's a tendency to say, I'm all for it until it costs me money. And as Stéphane Dion found out, they sure don't want to spend much money on that. So people resist taking on costs, as I say, when the disaster is not imminent and unequivocal. Now, Canada has some more problems, and that is our economy is largely based on commodity exports and on energy-intensive industries. We're home to a lot of wilderness, fresh water, large number of species, flora and fauna, and we therefore bear a disproportionate share of the costs in any efforts at conservation or environmental protection. Maybe we can afford it. So far we haven't done too badly, but we have to remember that we do, being based on commodity exports and energy-intensive industries, we do bear a special cost. As a federal state with strong regions and with our various commodities each in their own province, we might as well have a province of wood and a province of oil and a province of wheat and so on and so forth. With that kind of economy, we also have tremendous strains on our federation and on our cohesion as a country, and we're seeing some of those right now. Now, some countries can benefit by developing and marketing innovative devices or products to save energy or to cut down on pollution. To benefit in a serious way, however, you have to have world-scale manufacturing companies, and we don't have very many of those. I mean, we used to mention Northern Telecom at one point, and now we mention RIM. But you stop mentioning after that. There's not a hell of a lot to talk about after you finish with those. We don't have a lot of world-class manufacturing companies. We have some that are foreign-owned, but have world product mandates in Canada, and I regard that as ours, but not many. Most of the foreign-owned companies don't have world product mandates. They're much more limited in what they're allowed to do here. So other countries may be able to get the benefits of environmental protection in an industrial way when we cannot do so. So this is another serious problem we have. Now, I'm going to discuss climate change shortly, because it's basically energy policy. It's not environmental policy. The reason we're having such difficulty is trying to implement an energy policy in a country like Canada, where one place is producing all the energy and we're living off it, and the rest of us are willing to point fingers from time to time. The Canadian industries have not done badly. Canada has a pretty good record in industry in areas such as conservation of nature, fighting acid rain. The Canadian electricity providers and secondary industries like autos, pulp and paper, steel, oil and gas, mining and smelting, chemicals, transportation, and several others can certainly improve, but they've done fairly well compared to others in the world in reducing smog and water pollution. So generally speaking, I'm not one to point fingers at Canadian industry. I think we've done our bit. There's plenty of room for improvement, obviously. Now let's look at some of the ways that institutions like SEED can advance the environmental and economic causes. So now what I'd like to do is suggest to you that you take on certain areas as your pet areas. Obviously you will or you won't, but it's just some ideas that I wish to offer. First of all, measuring, monitoring, and publicizing. We said repeatedly at the National Roundtable, and Sandra Odendahl mentioned it this morning, that people need to be able to measure the state of the environment and the direction in which things are moving. It's obviously impossible to manage what you're not measuring. For businesses, that means reports should show their efficiency of their processes and what they're doing to eliminate or offset their environmental impacts. The Roundtable produced a workbook to help them do that in a standardized way, eco-efficiency. In fact, Alan Willis, who produced that with us, is here today, and he did a tremendous job there. But not that many companies are using it. For governments, it is urgent that the ministers of finance, not the ministers of environment, mark you, the ministers of finance should report annually on the state of the leading environmental indicators. I continue to call for natural capital to be reported on as part of the system of national accounts, not to detract from or change measures such as GDP, but to provide more context for them. Again, it was spoken about this morning when we made that. We had a promise from the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Martin, but it never happened. People within the Ministry of Finance opposed this every which way. They saw this as the thin edge of the wedge to try to change and tinker with their GDP. And no matter how many times we said we're not going to do that. In any case, I think SEED, working with StatsCan and Environment Canada, can do some research into these matters and help report to Canadians and the world on ways and means to accomplish better measurement and monitoring. Second thing I would suggest you prioritize. Public attention is a very scarce commodity. We should engage it strategically, and in Canada it's a lot easier to get Canadians to focus on measures that protect air, water, species, natural parks, than to get them to curtail economically crucial industries such as forestry and energy production. I'm not saying you should give up on the latter. I'm just saying you might want to set your priorities in such a way that you go for some of the issues where you can have a real impact relatively soon. It's also fairly easy and extremely important to alert the public about clear and present dangers to our health. That's an area that, for some reason, environmentalists are not doing what they really should be doing, and it's an area that people are worried about. If we can get the public to focus on health, they will not allow costs to become an issue. Instead, we're spending a tremendous amount of effort and time, in my opinion, we're wasting most of it, getting public cooperation on solid waste issues. The blue box, the plastic bags at the grocery store, this kind of stuff. These are not serious threats to our survival. These are not serious threats to our well-being. They're virtually without meaning, and they just make people feel good and think they're doing something. And the worst is that when you come to ask them to really do something important, they say, I gave at the bank, you know, meaning, or I gave at the office, meaning that they have a blue box and they take their time with it. It's a NIMBY issue. It's a bunch of politicians who don't want to have to fight with people to locate a modern landfill or a modern incinerator anywhere near where people are living and people are voting. It's as simple as that. And it's not a serious threat to humanity. Compared to climate change and compared to water pollution and air pollution and smog, it's a joke. But we spend a lot of time on that. Now, SEED can show the way in health-related matters by developing policies and encouraging technological effort regarding the presence of drugs and hormone-disrupting chemicals in drinking water, the concentration of smog components in air, and the harmful levels of pathogens and certain ingredients in food, such as trans fats, salt, and so on. Much broader testing of thousands of chemicals in daily use is required. We do test for cancer-causing tendencies and chemicals and for damage to DNA, but we almost never check for the effect of any chemical on infant brain development, on the immune system, on mood and cognition, or the endocrine system. Now, it may or may not be environmentally related, but there's some interesting evidence of the use of pesticides in Mexico, which makes me wonder about some of the effects on the young developing brain. But in any case, we have an epidemic of conditions such as asthma, ADHD, and autism. These are truly epidemic today, and it may have nothing to do with environment. I'm not saying it does, but I'm certainly saying that we should be doing the exhaustive research to find out if it does or it doesn't. And right now, we don't know that. There are also some very disturbing findings, not yet properly verified, I would say, regarding the male reproductive system, including lower sperm counts. Now, these still have to be confirmed and proven, work has to be repeated, but environmental factors need to be better studied in these areas. Finally, let me speak about climate change, so leave a little time for questions. Climate change mitigation, that is to say, trying to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, poses economic risks for our important resource sector in Western Canada generally. We know that. And it provides new opportunities only for very few manufacturers of environmentally beneficial devices. So it's very unlikely that Canada will be a leader in that particular realm. I mean, let's just face reality here. We will adopt certain measures as a condition for retaining a good reputation and also for retaining access to certain markets, particularly the US, but we will not find it easy to do so. Now, there are only a few skeptics who still argue that global climate change is not happening or that human activity is not the main contributor. But it's still beginning to appear that global climate change is here and will inevitably continue for a long time. And it's not a question here that only skeptics believe that. I think even people who understand these things also recognize that. There's several reasons why the trend will not be reversed very quickly. Take a small example. It's probably true that a small, but not necessarily trivial, amount of global warming stems from non-greenhouse gas effects. No, I'm not one of those skeptics. I'm not saying it's all due to the sun. I'm just saying that some part of it might not be provably related to human activity. Secondly, so even if we do improve our behavior, there still could be some effect going on. Secondly, a more important one by far, there are good reasons to believe that feedback loops have been set in motion already by the high levels of GHGs that we have. For instance, melting snow doesn't reflect the light back, it absorbs it. Melting tundra releases methane, so on and so forth. There are feedback loops that are already in progress. There's not much we're going to be able to do about those. We're going to have to just sit and live with them. Most important, we have to recognize how hard it is to get a change in energy dependency all over the world. We all need to do our part, and that includes Canada. We should not be blind, however, to the economic advantages that accrue to Europe vis-à-vis North America if truly effective measures are taken internationally on greenhouse gas reductions. Such reductions are far less expensive for the compact, densely housed population of Europe than for the sprawling, lavishly housed population and automobile-dependent people of North America. So there is a big reason why the Europeans are leading the fight for greenhouse gas pricing, and North Americans are lagging in that fight. Now, it's not a justification for it. We have to recognize that we've got to come to some way that the planet works together to save the future for all of us and for all of our children and grandchildren. But we can't blind ourselves to the fact that there's a huge economic advantage to Europe vis-à-vis North America in the traditional Kyoto-like arrangements. So it doesn't mean we have to give up on mitigation, not at all. It's a serious focus, and we need to do better costing and modeling of the various approaches to curtailing greenhouse gas releases. And we may need to pay more attention to the large-scale methods of mitigation, such as sequestration of CO2, as we know. I would say expansion of nuclear generation. Some of you will disagree, I'm sure. And better technology for using coal. But beyond mitigation, we must get serious about how we can adapt to the climate change that is now happening and will continue. Adaptation is a crucially important area, and I suggest that this is a place where your institute should be focused, because there's not that many people doing it. And we're going to need a lot of people ready to draft the agreements and the plans and the policies to bring this about. As several observers have noted, even in countries where the real problem is getting them to mitigate, they won't mitigate unless we promise to help them with adaptation. If the rich countries agree to give the poor countries some money to deal with the consequences of adaptation, then they might be willing to cooperate with us on the mitigation side. So it's not strictly one or the other. They are related. Now, SEED can and should play a leadership role, as I say, in planning for adaptation structures, treaties, Canadian international organizations, and to measure climate change effects and plan for protection and recovery. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has examined impacts and adaptations regarding systems and sectors. They've looked at new methods of assessment, effects on freshwater resources, alteration of crucial ecosystems, effect on agriculture and forestry, changes to coastal areas and low-lying lands, industry and human settlement, and threats to human health. It's a big area, in other words, and they have only scratched the surface on it. There's lots of room for leadership on the part of SEED, both nationally and internationally. You can produce the trained human resources that will be needed for the modeling, planning, and coping with these impacts. So in summary, this is a happy day. The creation of SEED is an important step for Canada. and the world. John thinks that I haven't given exactly a happy speech. The uniquely qualified personnel who will graduate and the faculty-led research will be of tremendous help to Canada and to the world. So I've suggested a few areas you might want to focus, and the areas you choose will determine the faculty you recruit. And it also will determine the alliances that you will make locally and globally. So this is the time you've got to get it right. The choices you make now are the choices you're going to have to live with. So I've offered a few suggestions. Feel free to ignore them, but at least there's something you might wish to think about. But mostly, congratulations and best wishes to everybody involved. We're looking forward to great excitement coming from here, and good luck to you all. Thank you.
Talk. It was very good.
Thank you.
The aspect of nuclear, I cannot understand why it's being ignored, and also why more money isn't being put into the development of hydrogen energy, which can be economically viable if it's developed properly.
Well, nuclear, there are two reasons why it's not going anywhere very quickly. One is, of course, that a lot of the environmental community is opposed to it, including the drafters of Kyoto. You know, Kyoto says you can't use nuclear as to reduce your carbon expenditures that you're going to be forced to pay for. They don't count nuclear. They say nuclear is not allowed. It's off balance, off limits. So there's obviously an anti-nuclear component. People are worried about the waste. So they feel that there are not good ways to get rid of the waste. Others are worried about it being converted ultimately to weapons use in one way or another. And there are a lot of people who are opposed to nuclear energy. The other reason is it's expensive. It's cheap to run, but it's expensive to build. And of course it's expensive to refurbish from time to time, as we've learned in Canada, in Ontario especially. So these are reasons why people are not so keen on nuclear. I thought this small nuclear, which the AECL was working on, I thought that was going to be fantastic. But it turned out that it didn't meet the predicted behavior. It wasn't that it did anything bad, but the predictions that they made were all based on rock-solid mathematical formulas, and when they fired up the reactor, it didn't meet those predictions. And so they felt, we got something here we don't understand. And they eventually had to stop that work, and that's why we don't have the isotopes now. So nuclear is not the popular thing, but in my opinion, when you look at coal and China building countless coal stations all over, the only serious competitor for coal is nuclear. So, but that's my personal view. Did I answer your question all right? Thank you.
I'd like to very much second that. Thank you for your very frank comments. I thought you came up with some really interesting points. One, I'd like to ask if you could explain a little more how you see climate as an energy policy, or what potential it has in being represented as an energy policy rather than an environmental policy. You talked at one point about natural capital, and I thought that might be a very interesting way. I wondered if you could perhaps tie it in with Tad Homer-Dixon's discussions on peak oil and the viability of tar sands production, etc.
Well, the reason I say it's not primarily an environmental issue is it's not really a pollution issue of the kind we're used to. It's a tragedy of the commons, but the commons in this instance is the capacity of the atmosphere, and it's truly the commons. It's the commons of the entire planet, as opposed to a group that can make a cohesive agreement. And so when I say it's not really environmental, I'm being a little bit argumentative. I'm really trying to say that where the rubber meets the road, it's not that you're going to breathe something poisonous, or you're going to eat something poisonous, or you're going to see a smog or something like that. I mean, carbon dioxide doesn't have any of those qualities, as you know. The problem is what it's doing to the layer of the atmosphere, a terribly important layer of the atmosphere. And so I don't mean to dismiss it as unimportant. What I'm saying is the real effect it has on people is on their use of energy. It's on how they price energy, and how they use energy. I mean, if you're going to deal with climate change, that's what it's about. So ultimately, you're coming down to things that are going to affect the price of energy. Energy security. For example, the Americans would like to not have to be dependent on the Middle East for their oil, and they're looking to Alberta as a place to produce oil, even if it does come from the oil sands. And not every American feels that way. There's a split, obviously, but I'm saying generally, energy security will probably trump carbon dioxide as an issue. And the same goes for energy pricing. It's okay if the price goes up 10 cents, 25 cents, $1, but if it goes up, $6, $7 per liter, at that point, people might start to object and to say we want nothing to do with this. I call it an energy policy because that's where it affects people. It's like an environmental policy affects me when I go out and I can't breathe. But this really affects people far more. You're going to feel the effect in your pocketbook long before you're going to feel it elsewhere. But when I speak of natural capital, you have a point that climate change could affect natural capital. It could dry up certain wetlands. It could make other areas, it could flood certain areas of low-lying areas. Particularly, it could wreck the fisheries because the fishery is often where the salt water meets the fresh water, and this is going to push the salt water back upriver, because as the sea level rises, the pressure is going to push the salt water back upriver, and the fish may not be able to live there. So it could totally damage the fishery, maybe eliminate it. So your point about it could affect natural capital is perfectly legitimate. I was just being a little argumentative and wanted to say that, if we look at it as environmental, it's not like all the other environmental problems. Sesame Street, it's not like the others. It's really, it affects people as an energy policy. That's where it affects people. But your point is quite correct. No?
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, very thought-provoking remarks, as usual. In terms of the forces, the economic forces we can bring to bear on the climate change issue, there's quite a bunch around, of course, of different forces. In Australia and the US and Europe and the UK, quite a lot. Capital markets, mainstream, long-term institutional investors have been also in their own way bringing some pressures to bear on the issue of how to deal with climate change. Not necessarily successful, but you may have some thoughts on the usefulness of that. It certainly is a concern to me. I think Canada's been a little bit slow. The Canadian institutional investors, the CPPIBs and the cases and the teachers of this world, are not necessarily seeing this as an issue to work with. But do you have some thoughts on the effectiveness, or is it reasonable to expect capital markets to be a good force for change in dealing with climate change?
Well, I think capital markets will move, and they will ultimately get on board with their cohorts in the United States and in the UK. But Canadian capital markets are far more influenced by US than they are by anything in Europe or anything in the UK, Australia, or anything of this kind. And so if the Americans are not moving ahead, the chance of us getting out way in front of the Americans on using capital markets for this, pretty unlikely, especially given just how dependent we are on oil, both as an industry and there are ways we could deal with this. If we really wanted to get into it, we could say when we export natural gas to the United States and they use it to supplant coal, that we ought to get the credit. Now, you can't right now. It's supposed to be priced in. That credit should be priced into the price for natural gas. But the truth is we're price takers on natural gas. We can't really price it in. But if there is, by international agreement, if they allowed us to price it in, then I think you'd see Canadian capital markets people becoming more interested because we do a lot of export of natural gas. So right now, it's all working against us. There's not much where we have any kind of natural advantage. And I think the capital markets will play a role ultimately, but it will probably be more or less following the American lead. I don't think it's going to go out front. That's my guess. I might be wrong. I've been wrong many times, as you well know.
Dr. Smith, I really appreciate your points about tragedy of the commons and using sustainability correctly, looking at appropriate indicators. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on your point around natural capital, getting it onto national accounts. Is that an opportunity where we could really explore a more socially responsible model around how we account for natural resources? Because it could be argued that the way we're treating them really is using, it's been said before, using the capital rather than the interest from the natural resources, and it's not ours to waste. It really, there's some intergenerational equity issues, and it just intrigued me, your comment on natural capital.
Well, thank you for your kind comments, and thank you for that comment. Yes, absolutely, you're right on. Exactly what I'm trying to bring about. See, I look at a situation, let's put it into really simple terms. I look at it that a Minister of Finance stands up and says, the country's in great shape. GDP is up, so on and so forth. And somebody else says, well, yeah, but, you know, we're running out of fresh water. Or we've cut all our forests. So somebody will say, well, we cut that forest, but we did it to put up a university. Well, all right, a lot of our ancestors did that sort of thing. Maybe it's not such a terrible thing to cut one forest to put up a university. But then I want to say, well, what's our rate of people attending post-secondary education? And so when we went to natural capital, I included human capital. I forgot to mention that here. And when we went to Paul Martin, I gave him a list from the roundtable and all its collaborators. We gave them a list, which included the wetlands, the forest cover, prime agricultural land, air quality, water quality, fresh water quality, the rate of education in post-secondary levels, and there's a health one too. Oh, yes, the percentage of healthy longevity. So we thought, okay, let's just put those down, and we're not asking you to change your GDP. Put your GDP up there, but also show some other graphs at the same time. And if they're all going in the right direction, fantastic. Congratulations, Minister, you've had a terrific year. But if the GDP is going one way and certain of these others are going the other, would you please explain this, and what are you going to do about it? That's the scene I had in mind. That's the scenario I was painting. And I had the Prime Minister agree to it. And then he backed away when Ministry of Finance officials wouldn't go for it. But I think you guys can do it. You know, keep at it. Work on it. Produce some papers. You know, get the attention of the media and so on. So it's something you could work on here and create alliances. You've got some important businesses obviously willing to talk with you. You had some represented here earlier, Royal Bank, IBM. I mean, you had some good people. You've got Suncor, all sorts of people who want to work with you. So I'm saying this is an opportunity to maybe succeed where we didn't quite manage. Well, look, I think we better let the wedding party, or one of us will be ending up an usher or something. So thanks a lot.